Sometimes love means never letting go, even when everyone else says you should. For 10 years, 72-year-old Irene Ellsworth has cared for Old Maybelle, a dairy cow who collapsed and never got back up. Most people think it's just stubborn kindness. Her family stopped asking questions long ago. They accept it like Irene's other rituals, polishing her late husband's boots every Sunday, keeping his coffee cup on the kitchen table. Then Dr. Kelsey Nguyen arrives for a routine visit. She sees something wrong with the bandage around Maybelle's leg. What she finds underneath isn't just infection. It's proof of something terrible buried under the barn floor for decades. The family learns that some secrets won't stay hidden. Irene's love for that dying cow runs deeper than anyone knew. What has Irene really been protecting all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Nebraska morning stretched across the Ellsworth farm like a worn quilt, patches of golden wheat stubble stitched together with fence lines that had seen better decades. Irene Ellsworth stood at her kitchen window, watching the sun climb over. Land that had belonged to her husband's family for 3 generations. The coffee maker gurgled behind her, filling 2 cups out of habit. One for her, one for Harold, though he'd been gone 10 years now. She twisted her wedding ring, the gold band worn thin from 60 years of marriage and 2 years of widowhood. The gesture had become automatic, like breathing, or the way she still set Harold's place at the table each morning. Some folks called it stubbornness, but Irene knew better. It was hope dressed up as routine. Outside, the farm showed its age in sagging fence posts and a barn roof that leaked when the wind came from the west. The Ellsworth dairy operation had dwindled to just a dozen head of cattle, barely enough to keep the place afloat. But it was home, and Irene had never been one to abandon what needed tending. Her son Tom's pickup truck rattled up the gravel drive, kicking up dust that wouldn't settle until the first frost. At 45, Tom carried his father's broad shoulders and his mother's determination, though worry lines had etched themselves deeper around his eyes each passing year. He worked construction in town now. Farm work alone couldn't feed a family anymore. "Morning, Ma," Tom called, stepping through the screen door with the easy familiarity of a man who'd grown up in this kitchen. His work boots, caked with yesterday's, in mud, left prints on linoleum that had seen 4 decades of similar traffic. "Coffee's ready," Irene said, pouring his cup without asking. Tom had taken his coffee black since he was 16, just like his father. Sarah followed him in. Tom's wife of 22 years, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She taught 3rd grade at the elementary school and had the patient expression of someone accustomed to managing chaos with gentle authority. Behind her came Emma, their 16-year-old daughter, earbuds dangling around her neck like a generational badge. "How's our patient this morning?" Sarah asked. Accepting her cup with cream and sugar, Irene's face softened. "Resting peacefully. I changed her bandage earlier, gave her fresh water." Emma glanced toward the barn, visible through the kitchen window. "Grandma, don't you think it's time?" "Emma," Tom's voice carried a warning. They'd had this conversation before, but Emma had inherited her grandmother's stubborn streak. "She's been lying there for 10 years, Dad. It's not normal." "Normal's different for everyone, sweetheart," Irene said quietly. "Maybelle served this farm for 15 years before she got sick. She earned her rest. The old dairy cow had been the pride of the Ellsworth herd once. A Holstein with perfect markings and production numbers that made other farmers envious. Harold used to joke that Maybelle could pay the mortgage single-handed. Then, one autumn morning 10 years ago, they'd found her collapsed in the pasture, unable to rise. The local vet had suggested putting her down, but Irene wouldn't hear of it. "She's not suffering," Irene had insisted then, just as she did now. "She eats, she drinks, she knows we're here. That's enough." Tom exchanged a look with Sarah, the kind of wordless communication that comes with decades of marriage. They'd learned not to argue with Irene about Maybelle, just as they'd learned not to question why she still polished Harold's work boots every Sunday, or why his coffee cup remained on the table. "The county extension office called yesterday," Sarah said, changing the subject with diplomatic skill. "They're sending a veterinarian around to check on livestock health, part of some outreach program." Irene's hand stilled on her coffee cup. "We don't need any checking. Maybelle's fine." "It's just routine, Ma," Tom said. "Free service, might as well take advantage." "I know what Maybelle needs." Irene's voice carried an edge that made Emma look up from her phone. "I've been caring for her just fine." Sarah reached across the table, covering Irene's weathered hand with her own. "Of course you have. But there's no harm in a professional opinion, is there?" Irene pulled her hand away, twisting her wedding ring again. "Some things don't need outside opinions." The kitchen fell quiet except for the tick of the wall clock and the distant lowing of cattle in the far pasture. Emma studied her grandmother's face, noting the tension around her eyes that hadn't been there moments before. "When's this vet coming?" Irene asked finally. "Today, actually," Tom said. "Around noon." Irene's cup rattled slightly as she set it down. "Today? We figured it was better not to give you time to worry about it," Sarah said gently. Through the window, they could see the barn where Maybelle had made her home for the past decade. Harold had built a lean-to shelter against the south wall, protecting her from the worst weather while keeping her close to the family. Irene visited her twice daily, bringing fresh hay and water, brushing her coat, talking to her in the soft voice she'd once used with her children. The farm itself told the story of gradual decline that had touched most small operations in the county. Paint peeled from the farmhouse shutters, and the machinery shed housed more rust than running equipment. But Irene kept the place tidy, the yard swept clean, flowers planted in neat rows beside the front porch. "Pride in small things," Harold used to say. "Dr. Nguyen seemed very nice on the phone," Sarah continued. "Young woman, just finished her residency. She's volunteering with the extension program while she builds her practice." "I don't want strangers poking at Maybelle," Irene said firmly. "She gets upset with new people." Tom leaned back in his chair, studying his mother. In the past year, her protective instincts around the cow had intensified. She'd always been devoted to Maybelle, but lately any suggestion of outside interference sent her into obvious distress. "Ma, when's the last time you let anyone else near?" "Maybelle, even me?" Irene's eyes flashed. "You have your own work to worry about. I can handle one old cow." "That's not what I meant." Tom's voice gentled. "I just think maybe it's gotten a little what?" The words hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Emma watched the adults dance around something she couldn't quite grasp. Her grandmother had always been independent, but this felt different, more intense, more desperate. A car door slammed outside, and Irene's head snapped toward the window. A small Honda sedan sat in the driveway, and a young Asian woman in khakis and a polo shirt was retrieving a medical bag from the trunk. "She's early," Sarah said, rising from her chair. But Irene was already moving, her 72-year-old frame propelled by sudden urgency. "I need to check on Maybelle first, make sure she's ready for company." "Ma, wait!" But Irene was already out the door, moving with surprising speed toward the barn. Tom, Sarah, and Emma watched through the window as she bent over the reclining cow, adjusting something near Maybelle's front leg. Dr. Kelsey Nguyen approached the front door, her professional smile faltering slightly as she noticed the family's concerned expressions through the screen. "The Ellsworth residence?" she asked, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone trained to deal with anxious pet owners. "That's us," Tom said, opening the door. "I'm Tom. We spoke on the phone. This is my wife Sarah and daughter Emma." Dr. Nguyen appeared younger than her phone voice had suggested, probably early 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her medical bag looked worn but well-maintained, the tools of someone who took her profession seriously. "Thank you for participating in our outreach program," she said. "It helps us understand the health needs of rural livestock and provides valuable services to farmers." "Our cows in the barn," Emma said, pointing toward where Irene was now standing. protectively beside Maybelle. Dr. Nguyen followed their gaze. She seems very devoted. That's one word for it, Tom muttered, earning an elbow from Sarah. As they approached the barn, Irene positioned herself between the veterinarian and the cow, her body language clearly defensive. You must be Mrs. Ellsworth, Dr. Nguyen said, warmly. I'm Kelsey Nguyen. Thank you for letting me examine Maybelle, Irene interrupted. Her name is Maybelle, and she doesn't like strangers. Dr. Nguyen knelt a respectful distance away, observing the cow with professional interest. Maybelle lay on her side in clean straw, her breathing steady but labored. Her coat showed signs of careful grooming, and a water bucket within easy reach suggested attentive care. How long has she been recumbent? Dr. Nguyen asked. Recumbent? Emma whispered to her mother. Unable to stand, Sarah explained quietly. 10 years, Irene said. She got sick and needed rest. She's been resting ever since. Dr. Nguyen's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained neutral. 10 years was an extraordinary length of time for a cow to survive in that condition, requiring constant care and medical attention to prevent complications. May I examine her? She asked. I'll be very gentle. Irene's grip tightened on the fence rail. She's fine. I take good care of her. I can see that, Dr. Nguyen said honestly. Her coat looks healthy. She's well hydrated. You've done an excellent job. I'd just like to do a routine check. Temperature, heart rate, basic assessment. Tom placed a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder. Ma, let her look. If something's wrong, we should know. Nothing's wrong, Irene said quickly. Everything's fine. But Dr. Nguyen had noticed something. Near Maybelle's front leg, partially hidden by the way the cow was lying, she could see the edge of what appeared to be a bandage. The fabric looked old, yellowed with age. Mrs. Ellsworth, is Maybelle being treated for an injury? Irene's face went white. It's nothing. Just a small cut that won't heal properly. 10 years is a long time for a cut to remain open, Dr. Nguyen said carefully. May I take a look? No. The word came out sharper than Irene intended, making everyone startle. I mean, she gets upset when people touch her leg. It's better to leave it alone. Emma frowned. In all her 16 years, she'd never seen her grandmother react this way. Irene was protective of Maybelle, certainly, but this seemed like something else entirely, fear maybe, or desperation. Dr. Nguyen studied the family dynamics, her training in rural veterinary work having taught her that animal health often reflected deeper human issues. The devotion this elderly woman showed to her cow was touching but potentially problematic if it was preventing proper medical care. Mrs. Ellsworth, she said gently, I understand your concerns, but if Maybelle has an ongoing wound that hasn't healed in 10 years, it could be causing her unnecessary pain. As a veterinarian, I have an obligation to assess any potential suffering. The word suffering hit Irene like a physical blow. She's not suffering. I would never let her suffer. Then let me help ensure that's true, Dr. Nguyen replied. A quick examination, that's all. Irene looked around desperately, at Tom, at Sarah, at Emma, seeking an ally who would understand why this examination couldn't happen. But she saw only concern and growing suspicion in their faces. Her wedding ring caught the afternoon light as she twisted it frantically, and for just a moment she looked not like the strong farm matriarch they knew, but like a frightened old woman carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. Dr. Nguyen moved slowly, her hands visible as she approached Maybelle. The cow's large brown eyes tracked her movement, but showed no signs of distress. After 10 years of Irene's gentle care, Maybelle seemed accustomed to human attention, even if she couldn't stand to receive it. She's beautiful, Dr. Nguyen said softly, running her hand along Maybelle's neck. The cow's breathing remained steady, and she even seemed to lean into the touch slightly. You can tell she's been loved. Despite her anxiety, Irene felt a small flush of pride. She was the best dairy cow in the county once. Harold always said she had the gentlest temperament of any Holstein he'd ever seen. Harold was your husband? My late husband. He passed 10 years ago. Dr. Nguyen noted the timing. The same year Maybelle had become unable to stand. Grief could manifest in many ways, and sometimes caring for an animal became a way of preserving connection to lost loved ones. She continued her examination, checking Maybelle's temperature, listening to her heart and lungs. The cow's vital signs were surprisingly stable for an animal in her condition, though her muscle mass had clearly atrophied from years of inactivity. "Her basic health seems good," Dr. Nguyen said. "You've managed her care remarkably well, but I'd like to examine that bandage now." Irene stepped forward quickly. "Please don't. She gets so upset when—" "Ma!" Tom's voice was firmer now. "Let her look." The bandage was positioned on Maybelle's left front leg, wrapped with the kind of careful attention that spoke of regular changing and maintenance. The fabric appeared to be torn from an old sheet, yellowed and soft with age, and repeated. Washing, Dr. Nguyen knelt beside the cow's leg, her experienced hands gentle as she examined the wrapping. "How often do you change this dressing, Mrs. Ellsworth?" "Every few days," Irene said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes more if it gets dirty." "And the wound underneath. Can you describe it for me?" Irene's hands shook as she twisted. "Her wedding ring. It's just a cut that won't heal. Some cattle get them, you know. Poor circulation when they can't move around much." But Dr. Nguyen had spent her residency treating farm animals, and something about this situation felt wrong. A wound that required constant bandaging for 10 years would likely have either healed or become severely infected. The fact that Maybelle showed no signs of systemic illness suggested something else was happening. "I'm going to unwrap this very carefully," she said. "If Maybelle shows any distress, I'll stop immediately." "No, please." Irene reached for the veterinarian's hands, but Tom gently caught his mother's wrists. "Ma, what's wrong? Why are you so upset about this?" Tears began forming in Irene's eyes. "You don't understand. Some things should be left alone." Emma moved closer, studying her grandmother's face. She'd never seen Irene cry before, not at Grandpa Harold's funeral, not during the hard years when the farm struggled, not even when they'd had to sell most of the dairy herd. Dr. Nguyen began unwrapping the bandage with professional care. The outer layers came away easily, revealing more yellowed fabric beneath. As she worked deeper, a strange smell began to emerge. Not the clean scent of healing tissue, but something more complex, almost metallic. "Mrs. Ellsworth, what kind of antiseptic have you been using?" Just what I had around the house. Peroxide sometimes. Salt water." The inner layer of bandage was darker, stained with something that looked like old blood, but had an odd greenish tinge. Dr. Nguyen paused, her professional instincts sending up warning signals. "Ma," Tom said quietly, "maybe you should tell us what really happened to Maybelle's leg." "Nothing happened," Irene said desperately. "She just got hurt when she fell, that's all." But Dr. Nguyen was carefully peeling away the final layer of fabric, and what she saw beneath made her breath catch. The wound was unlike anything in her veterinary experience. Instead of the clean healing tissue or obvious infection she expected, there was a deliberately maintained opening in the cow's leg, not deep enough to cause fatal damage, but kept open with what appeared to be small foreign objects embedded in the tissue. "My God," she whispered. Sarah stepped closer. "What is it? What's wrong?" Dr. Nguyen looked up at the family, her professional composure shaken. "Mrs. Ellsworth, this wound has been intentionally maintained. These objects in the tissue, they're not accidental injuries." Irene collapsed onto a hay bale, her face buried in her hands. "I never wanted anyone to see. I never wanted anyone to know." Tom knelt beside his mother, his voice gentle but insistent. "Ma, what are you talking about? What's in Maybelle's leg?" Through her tears, Irene's voice came out broken and small. "I couldn't remove them. Every time I tried, she would cry out, and I couldn't bear to hurt her more. So I just kept them clean, kept them covered, hoped maybe someday—" "What objects, Mrs. Ellsworth?" Dr. Nguyen's voice carried the careful tone of someone trying to understand a potentially dangerous situation. Emma had pulled out her phone, instinctively documenting something that felt historically important, though she didn't yet understand. Why Irene looked up, her eyes red with tears and something that looked like relief. It's jewelry, a ring and a necklace. They got embedded when she fell, and I've been keeping the wound clean ever since. Dr. Nguyen examined the site more closely with her penlight. The metallic glint of what appeared to be gold was visible within the tissue, and she could make out what looked like a small diamond, but the positioning and depth of the objects raised immediate questions. Mrs. Ellsworth, how exactly did jewelry become embedded in Maybelle's leg? The question hung in the air like smoke. Tom, Sarah, and Emma stared at Irene, waiting for an explanation that would make sense of this bizarre revelation. Irene's hands trembled as she spoke. There was an accident 10 years ago. Harold and we were in the barn with Maybelle, and there was a woman, a visitor. She fell, and when Maybelle tried to get away, she stepped on the woman's jewelry. It got pressed into her hoof, then worked its way up into her leg over time. Dr. Nguyen frowned. That's not how tissue trauma works, Mrs. Ellsworth. For objects to be embedded this deeply, in this location, there would have had to be significant force. It was an accident, Irene repeated firmly, but her voice lacked conviction. Tom stood slowly, his face pale. Ma, whose jewelry is it? The silence stretched unbearably. Maybelle shifted slightly, as if sensing the tension around her, and let out a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo off the barn walls. Ma, Sarah said quietly, where is this woman now, the visitor whose jewelry got embedded? Irene's wedding ring caught the light as her hands shook. She left. After the accident, she left town. But Emma, with the sharp instincts of someone raised on social media and true crime podcasts, was already thinking ahead. Grandma, if someone's jewelry got embedded in Maybelle's leg during an accident, wouldn't there have been blood? Wouldn't the woman have been hurt too? Dr. Nguyen was carefully photographing the wound site with her phone, her professional obligation to document potential evidence of animal cruelty overriding the family's obvious distress. Mrs. Ellsworth, I need to ask you directly, are these objects the result of deliberate placement in this animal? No, Irene's voice rose to near hysteria. I would never hurt Maybelle. I love her. I've taken care of her for 10 years. Then help me understand how this happened. Tom placed his hands on his mother's shoulders, feeling her tremble beneath his touch. Ma, whatever happened, we're your family. We'll get through it together, but you have to tell us the truth. Irene looked around at the faces surrounding her. Her son, her daughter-in-law, her granddaughter, and this young veterinarian, whose examination had just torn open a decade of carefully maintained secrets. The weight of years pressed down on her, and for the first time in 10 years she felt the possibility of laying down the burden she'd carried alone. But even as that possibility beckoned, terror gripped her, because the truth wasn't just about jewelry embedded in a cow's leg. The truth was about what lay beneath the barn floor, 6 feet from where they all stood. The truth was about why Harold had died with secrets on his lips, and why she'd spent 10 years making sure Maybelle never wandered far from this exact spot. I can't, she whispered finally. I can't tell you. Dr. Nguyen closed her medical bag and stood, her expression grave. Mrs. Ellsworth, I have to report this. What I've seen here constitutes evidence of animal cruelty, regardless of intent. The authorities will need to investigate. The word authorities hit the family like a thunderbolt. Emma's phone was still recording, capturing the moment their quiet farm life shattered into something unrecognizable. Please, Irene begged, please just leave it alone. Maybelle's not in pain. She's lived this way for 10 years. Can't we just leave things as they are? But even as she spoke, she knew it was too late. The secret was out, partially at least. And like water finding cracks in a dam, the truth would continue to seep out until everything came rushing forth. Tom looked from his mother to the wound in Maybelle's leg, to the barn floor beneath their feet, and for the first time began to wonder what else his family might be standing on top of. The kitchen felt different now, charged with unspoken questions and the weight of Dr. Nguyen's photographs. Tom sat across from his mother at the same table where they'd shared breakfast just hours earlier, but the familiar space had become a courtroom where truth and family loyalty battled for dominance. Irene clutched Harold's coffee cup with both hands, her knuckles white against the faded ceramic. She hadn't spoken since Dr. Nguyen left, with promises to contact the county animal welfare office by morning. The veterinarian's professional demeanor had softened with sympathy, but her obligations were clear. "Ma," Tom said gently, "we need to talk about what just happened." Sarah sat beside Emma at the kitchen island, both of them still processing the afternoon's revelations. The teenager kept glancing at her phone, where the video she'd captured played on silent loop. Her grandmother's breakdown, the strange wound, the glint of jewelry embedded in living tissue. "Should I delete this?" Emma asked quietly, holding up her phone. "Don't delete anything," Tom said, his voice heavier than usual. "We might need it later." Irene's head snapped up. "Need it for what?" "Ma, Dr. Nguyen is going to report this to the authorities. They'll want to understand what happened to Maybelle and why there's jewelry embedded in her leg. I told you what happened. It was an accident." Sarah leaned forward, her teacher's instincts sensing layers of truth waiting to be uncovered. "Irene, accidents leave evidence. If someone fell in the barn 10 years ago, if there was an injury serious enough to drive jewelry into Maybelle's leg, there would have been reports, hospital visits, insurance claims. Maybe the woman didn't go to the hospital," Irene said weakly. "What was her name?" Emma asked suddenly. "This woman who visited." Irene's fingers tightened on the coffee cup. "I don't remember." "You don't remember the name of someone who was injured on our property?" Tom's voice carried decades of experience reading his mother's tells. "Ma, you remember the name of every person who set foot on this farm since I was born." The silence stretched until the old wall clock's ticking seemed unnaturally loud. Through the window they could see Maybelle in her shelter, the fresh bandage Dr. Nguyen had applied bright white against her dark coat. "She was just passing through," Irene said finally, "a stranger looking for directions, and she ended up in the barn. Why exactly?" Sarah asked. Irene stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum. She moved to Harold's work boots, lined up neat and polished beside the back door, and began adjusting them with unnecessary precision. "Ma," Tom said, "those boots aren't going anywhere. Come sit down." But Irene continued fussing with the boots, her hands shaking as she touched the worn leather. These Sunday rituals had sustained her through 10 years of widowhood, small ceremonies of remembrance that kept Harold's memory alive. Now, even these felt threatened by the questions closing in around her. "Tell me about Dad's last few months," Tom said suddenly, "before he died. Was he acting differently, worried about something?" Irene's hands stilled on the boots. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one. Emma's right. This whole situation with Maybelle isn't normal. If Dad was alive when this happened, he would have done something about it. Harold never let an animal suffer, not for 10 minutes, let alone 10 years. Your father loved Maybelle," Irene said defensively. "I know he did. That's my point." Tom joined his mother by the boots, noting how she seemed to be seeking comfort from these remnants of her husband's life. "Ma, look at me." Reluctantly, Irene met her son's eyes. In them she saw Harold's same steady patience, the quality that had made him a good farmer and a devoted husband. But she also saw growing suspicion, and that broke her heart more than the veterinarian's questions had. Did Dad know about the jewelry in Maybelle's leg? Of course he knew. We found it together, and he just left it there. For months. That doesn't sound like the Harold Ellsworth I knew. Irene's composure cracked slightly. He was sick, Tom. Those last months he wasn't himself. The cancer was... Dad didn't have cancer, Ma. The words fell into the kitchen like stones into still water, creating ripples of confusion. Sarah and Emma exchanged glances, both certain they remembered Harold dying of heart failure, not cancer. "What are you talking about?" Irene asked, but her voice had gone very small. Dad died of a heart attack. Sudden, massive. Dr. Patterson said his heart just gave out. Tom studied his mother's face, watching color drain from her cheeks. Ma, there was no cancer, no months of illness. Emma pulled up her phone's browser, fingers flying over the screen. Within moments, she'd found Harold Ellsworth's obituary from 10 years earlier. It says here he died suddenly of cardiac arrest. Age 68, survived by wife Irene and son Thomas. The newspaper's archived words seemed to echo in the kitchen, stark black text contradicting the story Irene had just told. Sarah moved to stand beside her husband, creating a united front of concerned family members facing a woman who seemed to be unraveling before their eyes. Ma, Tom said softly, why did you just tell us Dad had cancer? Irene sank into her chair, the weight of a decade's worth of careful story management suddenly too much to bear. I got confused. The stress of today... You don't get confused about how your husband died, Emma said, her teenager's directness cutting through adult diplomacy. Grandma, what's really going on here? Through the window, clouds were building on the western horizon, promising the kind of late-afternoon thunderstorm that rolled across Nebraska farmland with little warning. The approaching darkness seemed to press against the kitchen windows, making the space feel smaller and more intimate. Maybe we should call Dr. Patterson, Sarah suggested. If there's some confusion about Harold's medical history, he could help. Clarify. No, Irene's voice was sharp. Don't call anyone. Tom knelt beside his mother's chair, taking her weathered hands in his own. Ma, I'm scared. This morning I thought the biggest problem in our family was whether we could afford to fix the barn roof. Now there's jewelry embedded in our cow. You're confused about how Dad died, and a veterinarian is filing reports about possible animal cruelty. Help me understand what's happening. Irene looked down at their joined hands, hers spotted with age and marked by decades of farm work, his younger but already showing the calluses and scars of hard labor. 3 generations of Ellsworth hands had worked this land, and she'd spent 10 years trying to protect that legacy from the truth of what had happened in their final year together. Your father was a good man, she said finally. I know he was. He loved this farm, loved his family. Everything he did was to protect what mattered to him. Tom squeezed her hands gently. Ma, that sounds like the beginning of a story, not the end of one. Outside, the first fat raindrops began spattering against the windows. Irene watched them trace random paths down the glass, each drop following its own course toward an inevitable ending. Some stories are better left untold, she whispered. But Emma, with her phone still glowing in her hands, was already typing new search terms into her browser. If her grandmother wouldn't tell them the truth, maybe the internet would. And somewhere, in the back of her mind, a terrible thought was beginning to form about why someone might keep jewelry embedded in a cow's leg for 10 years and what might be buried in the ground beneath their feet. The storm that had threatened all afternoon finally broke just after midnight, sending sheets of rain across the farmhouse roof and rattling the old windows in their frames. Tom lay awake, listening to the weather, but his mind kept circling back to the foundation stone of the barn, a cornerstone his father had laid when Tom was 12, carved with Harold's initials and the date, H.E. 1987. He'd helped his father mix the concrete that day, proud to be included in such important work. Harold had made a ceremony of it, explaining how a strong foundation was the most crucial part of any building. Everything else depends on what you put in the ground first, he'd said, tousling Tom's hair as they watched the concrete set. Now, 38 years later, Tom wondered what else might be in the ground beneath that barn. The next morning brought crisp air and the smell of wet earth. Dr. Nguyen arrived earlier than expected, accompanied by a county animal welfare officer, whose presence transformed the veterinary follow-up into something more serious. Officer Janet Reeves was a sturdy woman in her 50s with kind eyes but an unmistakably official manner. Mrs. Ellsworth, Dr. Nguyen said gently. I've reviewed my findings with Officer Reeves. We need to examine Maybelle more thoroughly and we'll need to document the site where the incident occurred. Irene stood at the kitchen window, watching the officials approach the barn. She'd been awake all night, walking the floors and twisting her wedding ring until her finger was raw. The foundation stone seemed to glow in the morning light, Harold's carved initials as clear as the day he'd made them. "Ma," Tom said, joining her at the window, "they're just doing their jobs. Are they going to take Maybelle away?" The question broke Tom's heart. Whatever secrets his mother was keeping, her love for the old cow was genuine. "I don't know. Maybe we should ask them." Outside, Dr. Nguyen was carefully photographing the barn's interior while Officer Reeves took notes. They'd brought equipment. Tom didn't recognize some kind of scanning device that Officer Reeves was running methodically across the barn floor. "What are they doing?" Emma asked, appearing in her pajamas with her ever-present phone. "Ground-penetrating radar," Sarah said, quietly. She'd spent an hour online after Tom had finally fallen asleep, researching everything from animal welfare investigations to what authorities looked for in suspected cruelty cases. "They're looking for disturbed Earth." Irene's face went grey. "Why would they do that?" "Because," Tom said, the pieces finally clicking into place, "embedded jewelry doesn't just happen by accident. If someone's ring and necklace ended up in Maybelle's leg, there has to be more to the story." Through the window, they watched Officer Reeves's scanner stop moving. She knelt down, examining a section of the barn floor near the foundation stone, then called Dr. Nguyen over. Both women crouched over the device's small screen, their expressions growing serious. "They found something," Emma said unnecessarily. Irene sank into Harold's chair at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she reached for his coffee cup. But instead of drinking, she just held it like an anchor, something solid to grip while her world shifted beneath her. "Ma," Tom said, "before they come to the door with more questions, is there anything else you need to tell us?" "Like what?" "Like why ground-penetrating radar would find something interesting under our barn floor." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of Officer Reeves's boots on the wooden barn floor and the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture. Through the window they could see both women now examining the foundation stone itself, taking photographs and measurements. "Your father carved those initials the day we poured the foundation," Irene said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember. I helped mix the concrete. He was so proud of that barn, said it would stand for 100 years, maybe more." Irene's fingers traced the rim of Harold's coffee cup. He never imagined what it might have to stand over. Tom felt ice form in his stomach. "Ma, what's under the barn?" Before Irene could answer, Officer Reeves was knocking on the front door. Tom answered, noting how the official's demeanor had shifted from routine investigation to something more urgent. "Mr. Ellsworth, we need to speak with your mother again. Our preliminary scan has revealed what appears to be a significant ground disturbance beneath the barn floor, approximately 6 feet by 3 feet, at a depth consistent with—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Consistent with intentional burial." Sarah's hand found Emma's shoulder, pulling her daughter closer. The teenager's eyes were wide with a mixture of fascination and horror as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "Burial of what?" Tom asked, though part of him already knew. "We'll need to bring in additional equipment to determine that. In the meantime, the barn is being treated as a potential crime scene. I'm sorry, but your family will need to stay clear of the area." Irene stood up so quickly that Harold's coffee cup shattered against the kitchen floor, sending fragments of ceramic and cold coffee across the linoleum. Nobody moved to clean it up. The broken pieces seemed to mirror something larger that had just shattered in their family. "Mrs. Ellsworth," Officer Reeves continued, "I need to ask you directly. Is there something buried beneath your barn floor?" As this question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and Tom found himself holding his breath as he waited for his mother's answer. "Yes," Irene said simply, her voice so quiet they had to strain to hear it. Emma's phone captured the moment. The exact second when their family's carefully maintained facade cracked open to reveal the darkness underneath. Later, she would delete that recording, but the memory of her grandmother's face in that moment would stay with her forever. "What's buried there, Ma?" Tom asked, though his heart was already breaking with the certainty of what she was going to say. Irene looked around the kitchen, at the 3 generations of her family, at the home where she'd spent 43 years as Harold's wife and 10 years as his widow. On the walls hung photographs of happier times: Tom's graduation, Emma's school plays, family Christmases, summers when the farm was thriving and the future seemed secure. "A woman," she said finally. "A woman named Margaret Chen. She's been there for 10 years, since the night your father died." The confession hit the room like a physical force. Sarah sank into a chair. Emma gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles went white, and Tom stared at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. "Ma," he said, his voice barely recognizable, "what did you and Dad do?" The arrival of the county sheriff's excavation team turned the quiet Ellsworth farm into something resembling an archaeological dig, complete with yellow tape, evidence markers, and the steady hum of official activity. Tom watched from the kitchen window as uniformed officers cordoned off the barn, transforming the building where he'd learned to milk cows and mend harnesses into a crime scene. Sheriff Michael Brennan had known Harold Ellsworth for 23 years, had bought eggs from Irene at the county fair, had even attended their 40th wedding anniversary celebration. Now he sat across from her at the kitchen table, his notebook open and his expression carefully neutral as he tried to reconcile the woman he'd known with the confession she'd just made. "Irene," he said gently, "I need you to start from the beginning. Tell me about Margaret Chen." Irene's hands trembled as she reached into Harold's work boots, the ones she'd polished faithfully every Sunday for 10 years. From a hidden compartment in the right boot, she withdrew a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was yellowed with age, and Tom could see feminine handwriting on the envelopes. "She wrote to Harold," Irene said, her voice hollow. "For 2 years she wrote to him." Sheriff Brennan accepted the letters with the careful handling of potential evidence. Love letters? She thought she loved him. And Harold, Irene's voice broke, Harold thought he loved her too. Tom felt the foundation of his childhood shifting beneath him. His father, the man who'd taught him about integrity and responsibility, had been having an affair. "Ma, how long did you know?" "I found the first letter by accident, hidden in the barn. Then I started looking, and there were more. So many more." Irene touched her wedding ring, the gesture automatic, but now tinged with bitter irony. Margaret was 28, a teacher at the elementary school in Minden. She thought Harold was going to leave me for her. Sarah's face had gone pale. She'd taught at schools throughout the county, knew the tight-knit community of educators. "Margaret Chen taught 3rd grade at Minden Elementary?" "You knew her?" Sheriff Brennan asked. "Not personally, but I remember when she disappeared. It was about 10 years ago. Mid-school year, she just stopped showing up for work. The administration said she'd had a family emergency and resigned suddenly." Emma was rapidly typing on her phone, pulling up news articles and social media posts from a decade earlier. "Here," she said, showing her screen to the others. "Margaret Chen, age 28, reported missing by her sister in California, last seen in Nebraska. Investigation closed after 6 months due to lack of evidence." The weight of that official abandonment hung heavy in the kitchen. A young woman had vanished, and the system had eventually given up looking for her. "Irene," Sheriff Brennan continued, his tone becoming more formal, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened the night Margaret died." Irene stared out the window at the excavation site, where technicians were carefully removing sections of the barn floor. Somewhere beneath those weathered boards lay the remains of a woman who'd written love letters to her husband, who'd believed in promises that would never be kept. "She came here on March 15th, 2015, Harold's birthday. She wanted him to choose, leave with her that night, or never see her again." Tom did the math quickly in his head. Dad died on March 16th. The next morning, Irene confirmed. He was in the barn all night arguing with her. I could hear their voices, but not the words. Around midnight, everything went quiet. And then, Sheriff Brennan prompted. I waited until dawn. When Harold didn't come in for breakfast, I went looking for him. Irene's eyes filled with tears. I found him collapsed beside the foundation stone. Heart attack, just like Dr. Patterson said. But Margaret, her voice failed her. Emma reached across the table, taking her grandmother's weathered hand in her young, smooth one. What about Margaret, Grandma? She was alive but hurt badly. Harold had pushed her during the argument, and she'd fallen against the concrete foundation. Her head was bleeding, and she wasn't moving right. She kept saying she was going to tell everyone about the affair, about the money Harold had been taking from the farm accounts to buy her gifts. Tom felt sick. Not only had his father been unfaithful, but he'd been stealing from their family farm to finance the affair. What money, Ma? Thousands of dollars over 2 years. Money we needed for equipment repairs, for feed, for paying the mortgage. Harold had been borrowing against the farm's equity and giving it to Margaret. The financial struggles that had plagued the farm in Harold's final years suddenly made terrible sense. Tom had assumed the difficulties were just part of the broader economic challenges facing small farms, but now he understood they'd been caused by his father's betrayal of both his family and their livelihood. So Margaret was injured but alive, Sheriff Brennan said, steering the conversation back to the crucial timeline. What happened next? I tried to help her. I really did. I got blankets, tried to stop the bleeding from her head. But she was so angry, kept threatening to destroy our family, to tell everyone what Harold had done. She said she'd make sure Tom lost the farm, that everyone would know Harold was a thief and a liar. And you couldn't let that happen, the sheriff said quietly. Irene's tears were falling freely now. She was dying anyway. I could see it in her eyes. The injury was too severe. But she wanted to take Harold's memory down with her, wanted to destroy everything he'd built. Everything I'd built. This farm has been in Harold's family for 3 generations. Tom was supposed to inherit something to be proud of. The confession was tumbling out now, 10 years of guilt and rationalization spilling across the kitchen table. I didn't mean to kill her. I couldn't let her ruin us. So I held a pillow over her face until she stopped breathing. Emma's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering against the table. Sarah made a small sound of distress. Tom stared at his mother as if she'd become a stranger. Then what? Sheriff Brennan asked, his professional demeanor intact, despite the horror of what he was hearing. I buried her beneath the barn floor where Harold had collapsed. It seemed fitting somehow. She'd caused his death with her demands and threats. The least I could do was keep them together. Irene wiped her eyes with a tissue. I broke up her jewelry and pushed the pieces into Maybelle's leg to explain any blood in the barn. Then I made up the story about her getting hurt when she fell. And Maybelle has been guarding the grave ever since, Tom said, the full picture finally becoming clear. She saw everything that night. After I buried Margaret, Maybelle lay down in that exact spot and never got up again. Like she knew what was underneath, like she was standing vigil. Sheriff Brennan closed his notebook, the investigation now clear in its tragic outline. Irene Ellsworth, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Margaret Chen. The excavation revealed more than just Margaret Chen's remains. As the forensics team carefully removed layers of earth and concrete from beneath the barn floor, they uncovered a child's toy truck, rusty and broken, its bright red paint faded to the color of dried blood. The truck bore a manufacturer's stamp that dated it to the early 1990s, years before Margaret's death. Detective Sarah Walsh specialized in cold cases, and she'd seen enough buried secrets to know that one discovery often led to others. She held the toy truck in her gloved hands, studying its worn edges and missing wheels. Mrs. Ellsworth, she said to Irene through the county jail's visiting room glass, this truck predates Margaret Chen's burial by at least 20 years. Can you explain how it got there? Irene sat in the orange jumpsuit that had replaced her familiar farm clothes, looking smaller and older than her 72 years. The past week in custody had stripped away the careful composure she'd maintained. For a decade, leaving behind a frightened old woman facing the consequences of choices made in desperation. "I don't know anything about a truck," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction of truth. The forensics team also found fabric fragments consistent with children's clothing and bone fragments that predate Margaret's remains by several decades. Detective Walsh leaned forward. "Irene, was Margaret the first person buried on your property?" The question hit Tom like a physical blow. He sat beside Detective Walsh, officially present as next of kin, but feeling more like a stranger learning about his family's history for the first time. The farm where he'd spent his childhood, the barn where he'd done chores and played with friends, had been hiding multiple graves. "Ma," he said quietly, "who else is buried there?" Irene's hands shook as she twisted her wedding ring, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing. "Your father never told me the whole story. Some things he kept to himself, even from me. But you knew there was already someone buried beneath the barn when you put Margaret there." "I suspected. Harold built that barn in 1987 when you were 12, but he'd owned the land for 15 years before that, ever since his father died. Sometimes he'd get quiet around the anniversary of the construction, like he was remembering something painful." Detective Walsh made notes on her pad. "Did Harold ever mention a missing child? Someone from the area who disappeared in the 1980s or early 1990s? The visiting room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the county jail. Through the reinforced glass, Tom watched his mother struggle with revelations that seemed to surprise even her. "There was a boy," she said finally. "Ricky Chen, Margaret's younger brother. He went missing when he was 8 years old, back in 1992. The family lived in town then, before they moved to California." Emma, who had been researching obsessively since her grandmother's arrest, looked up from her laptop. "Margaret Chen had a brother who disappeared? That's why she came to Nebraska. She was looking for him." Margaret was convinced Harold knew something about Ricky's disappearance, Irene continued. "That's how their affair started. She began visiting the farm, asking questions about that summer when Ricky vanished. Harold was charming, told her stories about the old days, showed her around the property. One thing led to another. Tom felt sick as the implications became clear. His father hadn't just been having an affair, he'd been manipulating a grieving sister who was searching for her lost brother. Did Dad know what happened to the boy? Harold's father, your grandfather Earl, was still alive when Ricky disappeared. Earl was... Irene paused, searching for words. He had a temper, especially when he'd been drinking. Kids used to come around the farm sometimes, looking for adventure or just exploring. Earl didn't like trespassers. Detective Walsh leaned forward. "Are you telling me that Earl Ellsworth killed Ricky Chen in 1992 and Harold helped cover it up?" "I don't know what happened exactly. Harold never told me the details, but after Earl died in 1995, Harold became obsessed with rebuilding the barn. Said the old foundation wasn't stable anymore, that he needed to pour new concrete. He spent weeks working on it, mostly at night, mostly alone. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with horrible clarity. Harold had rebuilt the barn to better conceal his father's crime, then years later had used the same location to hide his own victim. The foundation stone with his carved initials wasn't just marking the barn's construction, it was marking a family crypt. So when Margaret threatened to expose Harold's affair and embezzlement, Tom said, she was actually getting close to the truth about her brother's death. She said she was going to dig up the barn floor if Harold didn't tell her what happened. To Ricky, that's what they were arguing about that last night. Not just the affair, not just the money, but what Harold's family had done to hers. Emma had pulled up news articles from 1992, reading about 8-year-old Ricky Chen's disappearance. From downtown Minden, It says here the police questioned several local farmers, including Earl Ellsworth, but no charges were ever filed. The case went cold after 6 months. The same pattern as Margaret's disappearance 13 years later. Another Chen family member vanishing without a trace. Another investigation abandoned due to lack of evidence. Your grandfather was questioned? Tom asked his mother. Earl told the sheriff that Ricky had never been on our property, that he didn't know anything about the boy's disappearance. Harold backed up his father's story. The police believed them, because Earl was a respected member of the community, a church deacon, someone who'd never been in trouble with the law. But Tom remembered his grandfather differently. Earl Ellsworth had been a hard man who ruled his household with an iron fist and had little patience for children, even his own grandson. Tom had always been slightly afraid of Earl, sensing a capacity for violence beneath the old man's stern exterior. How did Harold live with himself, knowing what his father had done? Tom asked. Harold was 19 when Ricky disappeared, just a kid himself, trying to protect his family's reputation and his father's legacy. By the time he realized the weight of what he was covering up, too many years had passed to come forward without destroying everything. Detective Walsh studied her notes, connecting timelines and motivations across decades of deception. So Margaret Chen came looking for answers about her brother's death, ended up having an affair with the son of his killer, and ultimately died because she got too close to the truth. The Chen family has been destroyed piece by piece by the Ellsworths, Emma said quietly. First Ricky, then Margaret, and we're the ones who did it. Tom stared through the glass at his mother, this woman who had raised him with stories about integrity and family values, who had hidden 2 murders beneath the barn where he'd played as a child. The toy truck wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was proof that his family's legacy was built on the graves of innocent people. Ma, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. How do we live with this? The bundle of love letters found in Harold's work boot told a different story than anyone had imagined. Detective Walsh spread them across the conference table at the county sheriff's office, their contents reshaping everything the family thought. They knew about Margaret Chen's final night. Tom sat across from the detective, Emma beside him with her ever-present notebook where she'd been documenting their family's unraveling. Sarah had stayed home, unable to face more revelations about the man she'd called father-in-law for over 20 years. These aren't just love letters, Detective Walsh said, pointing to specific passages she'd highlighted. Margaret wasn't threatening to expose Harold's affair. She was threatening to expose something much more significant. Emma leaned forward, reading over the detective's shoulder. What do you mean? Look at this letter, dated March 10th, 2015. 5 days before Margaret's death. She writes, Harold, I found the records you thought you destroyed. The adoption papers, the forged death certificate, the bank transfers. I know what you did to my brother, and I know why you did it. You have until your birthday to make this right, or I'm going to the FBI. Tom felt the world shift beneath him again. Adoption papers. What adoption papers? Detective Walsh pulled out another letter, this one from a year earlier. Margaret had been investigating her brother's disappearance for decades, not just the past 2 years. She'd hired private investigators, obtained court records, traced financial transactions. She wasn't just Harold's lover, she was building a case against him. A case for what? Emma asked, though something in her grandmother's confession was starting to make horrible sense. Your grandfather, Earl, didn't kill Ricky Chen, Detective Walsh said quietly. He sold him. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Tom stared at the detective, unable to process what he'd just heard. Sold him? What do you mean, sold him? There was a black market adoption ring operating in Nebraska in the early 1990s. Children who wouldn't be missed. Runaways, kids from troubled families were kidnapped and sold to couples who couldn't adopt through legal channels. Earl Ellsworth wasn't just a farmer, Tom. He was a middleman in that operation. Emma's pen had stopped moving across her notebook. Grandpa, Earl kidnapped children and sold them? 8-year-old Ricky Chen wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last. Margaret's investigation had uncovered evidence of at least 6 other children who disappeared from the area between 1989 and 1994, all of them traced back to Earl Ellsworth's property. Tom remembered his grandfather's frequent trips to Omaha and Lincoln during those years, always with vague explanations about business that never quite made sense for a small-time farmer. He remembered strangers occasionally visiting the farm, well-dressed couples who would meet privately with Earl before leaving in expensive cars. Harold knew about this? Tom asked. Not initially, but by 1995, when Earl was dying of emphysema, he made Harold the executor of his estate. That's when Harold discovered the hidden bank accounts, the forged documents, the evidence of what Earl had been doing. Detective Walsh pulled out photocopies of financial records. Earl had accumulated over $200,000 from selling children, money he'd hidden in accounts under false names. Harold inherited not just the farm, but the proceeds from his father's crimes. And Margaret found out, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret had been tracking the money for years. She discovered that Earl Ellsworth had received a substantial payment in July 1992, the month Ricky disappeared, but instead of reporting it to police, she decided to get close to Harold to find out what happened to her brother and recover the money Earl had been paid for him. Tom felt sick as the timeline became clear. So the affair was never about love. Margaret was using Harold to get information about Ricky, and Harold was using the money from his father's crimes to fund the affair. The gifts he bought Margaret, the trips they took, the cash he gave her, it was all purchased with the proceeds from selling her own brother. The cruel irony was staggering. Margaret had been seduced by gifts bought with the money paid for her brother's kidnapping, while Harold had been unknowingly funding the investigation that would ultimately expose his family's crimes. What happened to Ricky? Emma asked quietly. Detective Walsh consulted her notes. According to Margaret's research, he was sold to a couple in Oregon who believed they were adopting an orphan from Nebraska. They renamed him Robert Collins. He grew up not knowing his real identity, thinking his birth parents had died in a car accident. He's alive? Tom couldn't believe what he was hearing. Very much alive. Margaret had been in contact with him for 2 years before her death. She'd hired genealogists and private investigators to track him down. By 2015, she'd not only found Ricky, but had convinced him to undergo DNA testing to confirm their relationship. Emma was furiously taking notes, trying to keep up with revelations that kept reshaping their understanding of the past. So Margaret wasn't just threatening to expose Harold's affair, she was threatening to expose a decades-old kidnapping ring, and she had the evidence to do it. Bank records, forged documents, witness testimony, DNA evidence. She'd built a federal case that would have sent Harold to prison for the rest of his life as an accessory to kidnapping and money laundering. Tom stared at the love letters scattered across the table, seeing them now not as romantic correspondence, but as evidence in an elaborate sting operation. Harold must have realized what she was doing. The final letter, written the night before. Harold's birthday makes it clear that Margaret had given him an ultimatum. Either he confessed to authorities and helped reunite the other victims with their families, or she would turn over all her evidence to the FBI and let Harold face federal kidnapping charges. That's what they were arguing about in the barn, Tom said. Not whether Harold would leave Irene for Margaret, but whether he would go to prison for his father's crimes. Detective Walsh nodded. Harold was facing a choice between destroying his family's reputation or spending the rest of his life in federal prison. The stress of that decision likely contributed to his fatal heart attack. And when Ma found Margaret injured but alive, she wasn't just protecting Harold's memory, Emma said, understanding dawning in her voice. She was protecting the entire family from federal prosecution. If Margaret had lived to present her evidence, the FBI would have seized the farm as proceeds from criminal activity. Your family would have lost everything, the land, the house, any assets purchased with Earl's money. Tom would have inherited nothing but legal liability. The weight of what his mother had done settled over Tom like a heavy blanket. Irene hadn't just murdered Margaret to protect Harold's reputation. She'd killed her to prevent the complete destruction of the Ellsworth family legacy. But there's something else, Detective Walsh continued, pulling out one final document. Something that changes everything we thought we knew about that night. She placed a medical examiner's report on the table, pointing to a specific section highlighted in yellow. The autopsy reveals that Margaret Chen was pregnant when she died. 12 weeks pregnant. Tom's world went silent. Emma's pen dropped from her nerveless fingers. Harold wasn't just Margaret's lover, Detective Walsh said quietly. He was the father of her unborn child, and according to her final letter, she'd already told him about the pregnancy. That's why she was so certain he would choose her over Irene. She believed Harold wouldn't abandon his unborn child. The revelation reframed everything. Margaret hadn't just been seeking justice for her brother. She'd been fighting for her unborn child's future, trying to force Harold to choose between his comfortable life with Irene and his responsibilities to the new family he'd created. So when Ma killed Margaret, Tom said, his voice hollow, she wasn't just murdering a woman seeking justice. She was killing Harold's unborn child, her own grandchild. Detective Walsh nodded grimly. Irene Ellsworth didn't just commit murder that night. She committed infanticide, destroying the Ellsworth bloodline she thought she was protecting. Emma looked up from her notebook, tears streaming down her face. Grandma killed my cousin, Harold's baby, part of our family. The truth was more devastating than any of them had imagined. The Ellsworth legacy wasn't just built on the graves of innocent victims. It was built on the grave of Harold's own child, killed by the woman who claimed to love him most. Margaret's engagement ring lay on the evidence table like an accusation, its diamond clouded with dried blood and tissue from a decade inside Maybelle's leg. Detective Walsh had carefully extracted it from the veterinary samples, and now it caught the harsh, fluorescent light of the conference room, throwing tiny rainbows across the scattered case files. Harold gave this to her 3 weeks before she died, Detective Walsh said, pointing to an inscription inside the band. To Margaret, my future. H.E. March 1st, 2015. Tom stared at the ring, trying to reconcile the romantic gesture with everything else they'd learned. He was going to marry her. According to her diary, Harold had promised to divorce Irene after his birthday, once he figured out how to handle the financial complications. Margaret believed they were going to start fresh in California with the baby. Emma had been silent for most of the morning's revelations, but now she looked up from her notebook with the sharp intelligence that had made her the family's unofficial researcher. Did Harold know about Margaret's investigation when he proposed? That's the million-dollar question, Detective Walsh replied. Margaret's diary suggests she hadn't told him about her evidence yet. She wanted to be sure of his commitment to their relationship before revealing that she knew about Earl's crimes. The engagement ring represented the moment when two deceptions had intersected: Harold's promise of a new life and Margaret's hidden investigation. Neither had realized they were manipulating each other, each believing they held the upper hand in a game that would ultimately destroy them both. Sarah had arrived an hour earlier, looking older than her 42 years and moving like someone, carrying an invisible weight. The past 2 weeks had aged the entire family, but Sarah seemed to be bearing the additional burden of wondering how well she'd ever really known Harold. What I don't understand, Sarah said quietly, is how Irene kept this secret for 10 years. How do you live with something like this? Dr. Nguyen, who had been quietly observing from the corner, spoke for the first time that morning. In my professional opinion, Mrs. Ellsworth has been showing signs of severe psychological trauma since I first met her. The ritualistic care of Maybelle, the obsessive maintenance of Harold's memory, the protective behaviors around the barn, they're all consistent with someone processing unresolved guilt and trauma. She was keeping vigil, Emma said suddenly, understanding dawning in her voice. All those years of caring for Maybelle, bringing her food and water, changing her bandages. Grandma was really tending to Margaret's grave. The psychological complexity of Irene's decade-long mourning ritual was staggering. She'd essentially been caring for the woman she'd murdered, using the injured cow as a proxy for the guilt and grief she couldn't openly express. "Has anyone contacted Robert Collins?" Tom asked, using the name by which Margaret's brother now lived. "Does he know what happened to his sister?" Detective Walsh nodded grimly. "I spoke with him yesterday. He's flying in from Portland for the final excavation and to make arrangements for Margaret's burial. He also wants to meet with your family." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. "He wants to meet with us?" Margaret kept detailed records of her investigation. Robert has copies of everything: photos, financial records, correspondence with Harold. He knows the full scope of what your family did to his. Sarah reached for Tom's hand across the conference table. "We don't have to meet with him if you don't want to. There's no legal requirement." But Emma was shaking her head. "Yes, there is. Maybe not legal, but moral. He deserves to face the people who destroyed his family." Tom studied his daughter's face, seeing a maturity that hadn't been there 2 weeks earlier. The revelation of their family's crimes had forced Emma to grow up quickly, to grapple with questions about legacy and responsibility that most teenagers never had to consider. "What does he want from us?" Tom asked. "Justice," Detective Walsh said simply. "And answers. Robert Collins spent 33 years believing his birth parents were dead. He has a right to understand how his life was stolen from him and why his sister died trying to get him back." Through the conference room windows, they could see news vans beginning to gather in the courthouse parking lot. Word of the investigation had leaked to local media, and the story of a decades-old kidnapping ring operating from a family farm was exactly the kind of scandal that attracted statewide attention. "We should prepare for media scrutiny," Detective Walsh warned. "This case involves federal crimes, missing children, and a murder cover-up spanning 2 generations. It's going to be big news." Tom thought about the farm where he'd grown up, where Emma had spent summers learning to drive the tractor and collect eggs from the henhouse. That peaceful childhood sanctuary was about to become the epicenter of a media circus. Its every corner examined and photographed as evidence of his family's crimes. "What happens to the farm?" he asked. "That depends on the federal investigation. If they can prove the property was purchased with proceeds from Earl's kidnapping operation, they may seize it under asset forfeiture laws. You could lose everything." The possibility of losing the family land hit Tom harder than he'd expected. Despite everything they'd learned about his grandfather's crimes and his father's cover-up, the farm itself still felt like home. The thought of strangers walking through his childhood bedroom, of bulldozers clearing the fields where 3 generations of Ellsworths had worked, was almost unbearable. "Maybe that would be for the best," Emma said quietly. "Maybe some places are too haunted to be homes anymore." Sarah squeezed her daughter's shoulder. You don't have to be so strong about this. It's okay to be sad about losing the farm, even knowing what we know now." "I am sad," Emma replied. "But I keep thinking about Ricky Chen, 8 years old, stolen from his family and sold to strangers. And Margaret carrying Harold's baby, murdered because she wanted justice for her brother. How do we get to keep our family home when we destroyed theirs?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Tom looked around the conference room at the scattered evidence of his family's crimes. The love letters, the financial records, the engagement ring, the photographs of excavated graves. Each piece told part of a story that had begun with his grandfather's greed and ended with his mother's desperate violence. "There's something else we need to discuss," Detective Walsh said, consulting her notes. "The other victims." Margaret's research identified 6 additional children who were sold through Earl's operation between 1989 and 1994. The FBI will be reopening all of those cases. 6 other families, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. 6 other Robert Collinses, all living under assumed names, all believing their birth families are dead. The FBI will be conducting DNA testing and attempting to reunite them with surviving relatives. Emma looked up from her notebook. So our family didn't just destroy the Chens. We destroyed 7 families. The scope of the Ellsworth family's crimes was expanding with each revelation, like ripples spreading outward from a stone thrown into still water. What had begun as the mystery of jewelry embedded in a cow's leg had become a federal investigation into decades of child trafficking. "When will the trial begin?" Tom asked. "Irene's preliminary hearing is scheduled for next month. If she pleads guilty, we might avoid a lengthy trial. If not," Detective Walsh shrugged. "Murder trials can take years, especially with this much evidence and media attention." Tom imagined his 72-year-old mother sitting in a courtroom while prosecutors detailed her crimes for television cameras. The woman who had taught him to tie his shoes and pack his school lunches would be remembered as a murderer, her life's work reduced to a footnote in a story about family secrets and violent desperation. "She won't survive a long trial," Sarah said, voicing what they were all thinking. "The stress, her age, the guilt she's been carrying. Prison is going to kill her." "Maybe," Emma said with the brutal honesty of adolescence. "That's what justice looks like." Outside, the first news truck was setting up cameras on the courthouse steps. Soon, reporters would be standing in front of the Ellsworth farm, telling the world about Earl's kidnapping ring and Harold's cover-up and Irene's desperate murder. The family's private shame was about to become public spectacle. But first, they had to face Robert Collins, the little boy who had been sold like livestock, the man who had spent his adult life searching for answers about his stolen childhood. Tomorrow, he would sit across from them in this same conference room and ask the questions that had no good answers. Why did your family destroy mine? How do you live with what you've done? And what can you possibly do to make it right? Tom twisted. His own wedding ring, a gesture he'd unconsciously adopted from his mother and prepared to face the consequences of crimes he hadn't committed but had inherited nonetheless. Robert Collins entered the conference room with the measured step of a man who had spent 33 years preparing for this moment without knowing it. At 41, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built a successful life from nothing, but his eyes held the wariness of a person who had learned not to trust easily. He looked nothing like the 8-year-old boy in the missing person flyers that Emma had found online. Years of living as Robert Collins had given him the bearing of a Pacific Northwest executive, which, Detective Walsh had explained, was exactly what he'd become. He ran a non-profit organization that helped reunite missing children with their families, a career choice that now seemed tragically prophetic. Tom stood as Robert approached the table, unsure of the protocol for meeting the brother of a woman your mother had murdered. Should he offer his hand, express condolences, apologize for crimes he hadn't committed but had inherited? "Mr. Collins," he said finally, settling for simple acknowledgement. "Please, call me Ricky," the man replied, his voice carrying just a trace of the Midwest accent he'd lost decades ago. "I've been thinking a lot about names lately, about who I really am underneath the identity someone else gave me." Sarah and Emma had positioned themselves slightly behind Tom, creating a family unit that faced Robert across the conference room table. The morning light coming through the windows seemed to divide the room into sides, the Ellsworths on one, the last surviving Chen on the other. "I want to thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Robert continued, taking a seat across from them. "I know this must be difficult for your family." Emma looked up sharply at his tone. She'd expected anger, accusation, demands for justice. Instead, Robert Chen Collins spoke with the measured compassion of someone accustomed to dealing with other people's trauma. "Mr. Collins, Ricky," Tom corrected himself, "we're the ones who should be thanking you. What our family did to yours, there aren't words for it." Robert nodded slowly, studying Tom's face, as if searching for traces of the grandfather and father who had shaped his stolen childhood. I spent most of my life wondering what my birth family was like. Margaret used to write me letters describing our parents, our extended family back in California. She painted this picture of people who loved me, who never stopped looking for me. He paused, pulling a photograph from his jacket pocket. It showed two young children, a girl of perhaps 10 and a boy of 8, standing in front of a small house with their arms around each other's shoulders. Margaret and Ricky Chen, before Earl Ellsworth had torn their world apart. "This is the only picture I have of us together," he said, placing it on the table between them. "Margaret kept it her whole life, carried it with her when she came to Nebraska to find me. Your mother buried it with her." Tom stared at the photograph, seeing the future that Earl's crimes had destroyed. The little girl would grow up to become a teacher and investigator, devoting her life to finding her stolen brother. The little boy would grow up believing his birth family was dead, never knowing that his sister was searching for him. "Margaret wrote about you in her diary," Robert continued, looking directly at Tom. "She said you seemed like a good man who'd been lied to about his own family's history. She felt sorry for you, actually." The words hit Tom like a physical blow. "She felt sorry for me. She understood that you were a victim too, in a way, that Harold had hidden the truth from his own son, just like Earl had hidden it from Harold. Initially, she didn't want to destroy your life. She just wanted to save the other victims before it was too late." Sarah reached for Tom's hand under the table, feeling him tremble with the weight of Margaret's undeserved compassion. "What do you want from us?" she asked quietly. Robert considered the question for a long moment, his executive training evident in the way he organized his thoughts before speaking. "I want you to help me find the others. The 6 children your grandfather sold between 1989 and 1994. Margaret had started building cases for each of them, but she died before she could complete the work." He opened a briefcase and removed a thick folder, spreading documents across the table. Financial records, birth certificates, photographs of children who had vanished without a trace, Earl's other victims, waiting to be found. "This is Timothy Martinez, age 7, disappeared from Grand Island in 1989. This is Jennifer Walsh, age 6, vanished from her foster home in 1991. This is David Park, age 9, last seen walking home from school in 1993. Each photograph showed a smiling child, frozen at the moment before their lives were stolen and sold. Emma found herself memorizing their faces, these brothers and sisters in suffering who had shared her family's terrible legacy. "They're all adults now," Robert continued, "living under false names, raising families of their own, never knowing. They have birth relatives who are still looking for them. Margaret died trying to give them back their real identities. I want to finish what she started." Tom looked around the table at the evidence of his grandfather's crimes, at the faces of children who had been treated like livestock in some grotesque auction. "What do you need from us?" "I need your family's financial records," Robert said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was asking. "Every bank account Earl maintained, every property transaction, every unexplained deposit between 1989 and 1994. The FBI has some of this information, but Margaret believed Harold might have additional records hidden on the farm." Tom felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Cooperating with Robert meant potentially implicating his family in federal crimes, exposing every secret Earl and Harold had tried to bury. But refusing meant abandoning 6 stolen children to lives built on lies. "There's a safe in the basement," Emma said suddenly, her voice cutting through her father's internal struggle. "Behind Grandpa Harold's workshop. I saw Grandma opening it once when I was little." Sarah looked at her daughter with surprise. "You never mentioned a safe." "I didn't think it was important. Grandma just said it was where Grandpa kept important papers." Emma turned to Robert. "If there are records, they'd be in there." Robert nodded, making notes in a leather portfolio. "What else can you tell me about Earl's activities during those years?" Regular trips, unusual visitors, any behavior that seemed odd at the time. Tom closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember his grandfather through the lens of what they now knew. He traveled a lot, said he was buying cattle or farm equipment, but he never came back with anything. Sometimes he'd be gone for days, especially around the times of county fairs or agricultural shows. Hunting grounds, Robert said grimly. Places where missing children might blend into crowds, where predators could operate without drawing attention. The clinical way Robert discussed his own kidnapping was heartbreaking. This man had spent his career helping other families find their missing children, never knowing he was one of them himself. The couples who visited the farm, Sarah said, remembering fragments of conversations with Harold over the years. Harold used to mention wealthy people from out of state who came looking at livestock, but they never seemed particularly interested in cattle. They were shopping for children, Robert confirmed. Margaret's research suggests Earl charged between $15,000 and $30,000 per child, depending on age and gender. Younger children brought higher prices. Emma's pen had stopped moving across her notebook. The mechanical discussion of human trafficking prices was beyond anything her 16-year-old mind was equipped to process. "How do you talk about this?" "So calmly?" she asked. Robert's composure cracked slightly, revealing the pain he'd been carefully containing. "Because if I let myself feel the full weight of what was done to me, to Margaret, to these other children, I won't be able to function. And if I can't function, I can't help find them." The conference room fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic and the hum of fluorescent lights. Through the windows, they could see more news vans arriving, drawn by the growing scandal. "Of the Ellsworth family's crimes. What happens after we find them?" Tom asked. "These people have built lives as other people. They have families, careers, children of their own. Do we have the right to destroy all of that with the truth?" "We have the right to give them the choice," Robert replied. "The choice that was stolen from all of us. Some will want to reconnect with their birth families. Others might prefer to keep the lives they've built. But they deserve to know who they really are." Detective Walsh, who had been quietly observing the conversation, spoke up for the first time. "There's also the legal aspect to consider. Each of these cases represents federal kidnapping charges. If we can build solid cases against Earl's operation, it might help in Irene's sentencing." The reminder that his mother was still facing murder charges brought Tom back to the immediate crisis. What kind of help are we talking about? Reduced charges if we cooperate? Potentially. Judges look favorably on defendants who help right historical wrongs, especially when it involves finding missing children. It won't eliminate the charges against Irene, but it might influence her sentencing. Robert reached into his briefcase and withdrew a simple granite headstone, setting it carefully on the conference table. The inscription read, "Margaret Chen, 1987-2015, beloved sister and mother." "I had this made for Margaret's grave," he said. "I wanted her to be remembered not just as a victim, but as someone who died fighting for her family. For me." The word mother hit Tom like a physical blow. Margaret's unborn child, Harold's child, would finally be acknowledged even in death. "There's something else," Robert continued, his voice softening. "I'd like to hold a memorial service for Margaret at the farm. Where she died, where she's been buried all these years. Would your family be willing to host something like that?" The request was simultaneously generous and devastating. Robert wanted to honor his sister's memory in the place where she'd been murdered, to transform the scene of her death into a celebration of her life. Emma looked up from her notebook, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said before her father could respond. "Yes, we'll do that. It's the least we can do." And in that moment, Tom realized that his daughter had become the moral compass their family desperately needed, the one person willing to face the full truth of what they'd inherited and what they owed to those they'd harmed. 6 months after Maybelle's peaceful death under the October sky, The Ellsworth farm looked nothing like the place where Tom had grown up. The barn had been demolished, its foundation excavated and blessed by clergy from 3 different faiths. In its place stood a young oak tree, its autumn leaves catching the late afternoon light as visitors gathered for the dedication ceremony. Irene sat in her wheelchair beside the sapling, her hands folded over the blanket that covered her diminished frame. The stroke had come 3 months into her prison sentence, leaving her partially paralyzed and dependent on the county's medical facility for inmates. At 73, she looked far older, but her eyes remained clear and focused on the tree that had been planted where Margaret Chen had lain buried for 10 years. She would have liked this tree, Irene said quietly, her speech still slightly slurred but understandable. Margaret always talked about wanting a garden when she and Harold moved to California. Tom knelt beside his mother's wheelchair, adjusting the blanket around her legs. The past 6 months had aged him visibly, grey, threading through his hair and new lines etched around his eyes. But there was something lighter in his bearing now, the relief of a man who no longer carried secrets. Dr. Nguyen thinks oak trees represent strength and endurance, Tom said. She helped us choose this variety. It'll grow tall enough to be seen from the road, so people will remember what happened here. Robert Collins stood near the memorial plaque that had been installed at the tree's base, reading the inscription aloud for the gathered crowd. In memory of Margaret Chen and her unborn child and all victims of family secrets. Truth delayed is not truth denied. The ceremony had drawn a surprisingly diverse group. Dr. Nguyen was there with her veterinary colleagues, having become something of a local hero for uncovering the decades-old crimes. Sheriff Brennan attended in his dress uniform, representing the law enforcement community's commitment to justice. Several teachers from the elementary school, where Margaret had worked, came to honor their missing colleague. But the most important guests were the people whose lives had been changed by Margaret's investigation. Jennifer Walsh, now Jennifer Morrison, a nurse from Denver, stood with her birth mother, whom she'd been reunited with after 34 years of believing her family was dead. Timothy Martinez had flown in from Phoenix with his wife and teenage son, all of them still processing the revelation that his entire childhood identity had been fabricated. Emma moved through the crowd with a dignity beyond her 16 years, carrying a folder of letters from the 4 other victims who couldn't attend in person. Each had written to thank the Ellsworth family for helping expose the truth, for giving them back their real names and histories. Sarah stood beside the farmhouse porch, watching her daughter navigate conversations with adults whose lives had been forever changed by their family's crimes and revelations. Emma had grown up visibly in the past 6 months, her teenage concerns replaced by a mature understanding of justice and responsibility. "She's remarkable," Robert said, joining Sarah on the porch. "You should be proud of how she's handled all of this." "I am," Sarah replied, "but I worry about the weight she's carrying. She feels responsible for our family's legacy in a way that isn't fair to someone her age." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "I felt the same way when I started my non-profit, like I had to personally fix every broken family I encountered. But Emma's doing something different. She's helping create a foundation for healing rather than just trying to repair damage." Indeed, Emma's college application essays had all focused on her family's experience with buried secrets and the importance of truth in building healthy communities. She'd been accepted early to several universities with strong criminal justice programs, determined to spend her life helping families confront difficult truths rather than hiding from them. The memorial service was simple but powerful. Robert spoke about Margaret's courage in pursuing justice for her brother, about her love for the unborn child she'd carried, and about the hope that her death might prevent other families from suffering similar losses. Tom read a statement, acknowledging his family's responsibility for the pain caused by 3 generations of buried secrets. But the most moving moment came when Irene asked Tom to wheel her closer to the oak tree. With tremendous effort, she reached out to touch the young bark, her paralyzed hand trembling with the exertion. "Margaret," she whispered, tears flowing freely down her weathered cheeks. "I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry for what I took from you, from your baby, from your brother. I hope someday you can forgive a foolish old woman who chose fear over truth." The crowd fell silent as Irene wept, her decades of carefully maintained composure finally crumbling in the face of what she'd done. Robert approached her wheelchair, kneeling so they were at eye level. "Margaret forgave you before she died," he said gently. "She wrote in her diary that she understood why Harold's family would protect each other, even if she couldn't accept it. She knew you were afraid." As the sun set over the Nebraska plains, the visitors gradually departed, leaving the Ellsworth family alone with their transformed legacy. The farm would be sold within the year. Federal asset forfeiture laws had claimed most of the property, but the family had been allowed to keep the house and a small plot of land around the memorial tree. Tom had found work as a construction supervisor in town. Sarah continued teaching, and Emma spent her free time maintaining correspondence with the other victims and their families. They were building a new kind of family legacy, one based on truth-telling rather than secret-keeping, on facing consequences rather than avoiding them. The oak tree stood sentinel over the site where so much pain had been buried, its roots growing deep into soil that had been blessed and cleansed and dedicated to memory rather than concealment. In the spring, Emma planned to plant a garden around its base, vegetables and flowers that would grow in the light, visible to anyone who passed by. Some secrets, once exposed, create space for new growth. The Ellsworth family was learning to tend that space with the same devotion Irene had once shown to Old Maybelle, but with a commitment to transparency that honored both the victims of their families' crimes and the possibility of redemption through truth.